Today, we will examine two of the most dangerous stories in history. First, a man who was blinded by flames engulfing his head hundreds of meters below the surface, and his friends who made an extraordinary effort to bring him back to the surface. Second, an inexperienced explorer who ignored his friend's warnings not to enter a passageway and became trapped there for hours. His friend had to completely strip him to rescue him. Welcome to Cave Tragedies. March 19, 1983, West Virginia. Three cave explorers set out to explore a cave system in West Virginia. The cave presented a challenging environment requiring serious technical skills for exploration. Reaching the entrance required a series of vertical descents and climbs, and the cave extended deep underground through corridors, formed by narrow passages created by collapsed rock piles that formed narrow gaps between massive boulders. Kent Sievers was 30 years old. He was accompanied by two close friends, David and Michael. The three had been exploring caves together for years. They knew each other's strengths and weaknesses. They trusted each other. That trust would save Kent's life a few hours later. On this special spring day, the three experienced cave explorers entered the depths of the cave. They all used carbide lamps for lighting. These lamps work by dripping water onto calcium carbide pellets, producing acetylene gas that burns with a bright, steady flame. Carbide lamps had been standard for cave explorers for decades. They were reliable and provided good light. However, they also produced acetylene gas, which is extremely flammable and explosive when mixed with air in the right proportions. The trio spent 10 hours underground. It was an exhausting but rewarding day. They had seen magnificent formations, taken photos, and laughed together. When they decided to ascend, they had a significant journey ahead of them to reach the surface. Halfway up, the group took a break and began refilling their carbide lamps. After 10 hours of burning, the lamps were running low on fuel. Kent Sievers opened his bag to get to the calcium carbide stock. The bag was made of ballistic nylon. What Kent didn't realize was that this material had essentially become gas-tight. The calcium carbide pellets he was carrying had become damp due to the humidity in the cave atmosphere, and the wet pellets had started to produce acetylene gas. Over the course of 10 hours, a significant amount of acetylene had accumulated inside the bag, and the bag's tight weave had trapped the gas inside, creating a bomb ready to explode. Kent held the dim light of his carbide lamp in one hand while opening the zipper of the bag with the other. At that moment, the gas that had accumulated in the bag began to mix rapidly with the air. The gas ignited as soon as it reached the flame. In an instant, the cave was lit up by a ball of yellow flame. Imagine, 1 second everything is normal. The next second your face is engulfed in a ball of flame. Imagine the pain, the shock, the fear. David and Michael helplessly watched their best friend's face burn. Those few seconds left indelible marks on all three of their lives. When the flames dispersed, Kent was still standing, but something was very wrong. He opened his eyes, closed them, then squeezed them shut and waited a moment, then opened them again. Nothing had changed. Everything was dark. Absolute darkness. No light from carbide lamps, no shadows, no shapes, nothing. Kent couldn't see anything. At that moment, Kent's world collapsed. He brought his hands to his face, touched his eyes, as if touching them would bring back his sight. His breathing quickened. He panicked. He tried to speak, but only muffled sounds came out. In his 30 years of life, he had never felt so helpless. David and Michael stared in shock at the scene before them. Before their eyes, the gas from the bag had formed a fireball and exploded on Kent's face. Kent's face was burned, his eyebrow and the front of his hair gone in the fire. Although horrified, they knew that panicking in such a situation, especially since they were hours away from the surface, would put Kent in even greater danger. Both had encountered such situations before and knew how to react. David held Kent tightly by the shoulders. Michael approached. They both held him. They began to talk to him. Their voices trembled, but they tried to appear calm. After minutes that felt like hours, Kent's panicked breathing slowly calmed down. Finally, Kent was able to speak in a fearful voice. He asked what had happened, but he already knew. He asked if his eyes were damaged. David and Michael examined Kent's face in the light of their carbide lamps. His eyebrows were burned, and there were burn marks on his face, but his eyes looked fine. There was no obvious damage. Hearing this, Kent felt a little relieved. His blindness might be temporary, and perhaps his sight could return. Michael and David began to think, should they wait for help and call the rescue team, or should they get Kent out themselves? Getting him out of the cave themselves carried carried irreversible risks. Kent was blind, and the slightest wrong move could lead to his death. However, waiting for help was even riskier. The cave was cold, and Kent was at risk of hypothermia. The injury to his eye required urgent medical attention, and every passing hour increased the risk of permanent blindness. David and Michael faced a challenging journey ahead. A path filled with obstacles lay before them. Michael would lead the way, telling Kent what to do at every step, where to place his hands, where to step, when to pull. David would stay behind, ready to help if Kent fell or got stuck. They began their return journey. The first climb was 30 meters. Michael began climbing, searching for deep crevices and solid protrusions to make Kent's climb easier. Kent followed him, trying to find the indentations and protrusions with his hands and feet, following Michael's commands and moving slowly. David followed right behind Kent, ready to catch him if his friend lost his balance. The first 5 meters passed relatively smoothly. Michael gave instructions from above. Kent searched for handholds by feeling with his hands, and David waited behind, ready to provide support. However, at the 6th meter, things got complicated. Michael told Kent to reach his right hand up toward a ledge about 30 centimeters to the right. Kent reached out. His fingers wandered through the air, touched the rock, but couldn't find the ledge. The disorientation from being blind had completely disrupted his distance perception. Michael noticed and changed his position. Securing himself with one hand, he reached down with the other, grasped Kent's wrist, and guided his hand directly onto the ledge. Kent gripped tightly with relief, but this solution created a new problem. Michael had to guide Kent while hanging by one arm. His arms began to tremble. Muscle fatigue was building rapidly. At the 12th meter, the critical moment came. Kent's left foot slipped from its ledge. His body swung backward. That momentary falling sensation was pure terror for someone who couldn't see. Kent squeezed with all his strength to keep his hands from separating from the rock. David reacted instantly. He grabbed Kent's backpack and pushed him toward the wall. Kent's chest hit the rock. It hurt, but he didn't fall. For a few seconds, all three remained motionless, only heavy breathing echoing in the cave. Michael looked down and asked if Kent was okay. Kent's voice came out cracked, but he said he could continue. They climbed the remaining 18 meters this way. Michael scouted ahead. Kent followed blindly. David served as a safety net behind. At the 20th meter, Michael found a platform and pulled Kent up. The first climb was over, but there were still 5 more climbs ahead, each potentially just as dangerous as the first. For Kent, every step was a leap of faith. He couldn't see the footholds he reached or the void beneath him. He relied solely on his friends' voices. Imagine climbing in complete darkness, hundreds of meters below the surface, unable to see where you're gripping, stepping, or climbing, relying solely on someone's voice. How terrifying would that be? When they reached the narrow passages, things became much more difficult. In these sections, Kent moved forward by touching Michael's foot. Wherever Michael's foot went, Kent went too, step by step, inch by inch. Consider Michael's situation. His friend's life was literally in his hands. Every word, every instruction was crucial. One mistake could cause Kent to fall or get stuck. The responsibility must have been overwhelming, but Michael didn't give up. He remained calm. He continued to guide him. David carried the same burden. Behind them, he watched Kent's every move, ready to catch him if he fell, to help him if he got stuck. Hours passed. What would normally take 2 hours to climb out took 8 grueling hours. And finally, light. David and Michael almost cried when they saw the cave entrance. Kent couldn't see, but he could hear the relief in his friends' voices. By the time they got out, it was night. Kent stood under stars he couldn't see. He felt the night wind on his face. He was alive. He was alive thanks to his friends. Kent was rushed to the hospital. Doctors treated the burns on his face, but the real problem was his eyes. After a series of examinations, they said the blindness was temporary. 2 weeks later, Kent's vision returned to normal. There was no permanent damage. It was a miraculous recovery. November 6th, 2015. In late November, a group of 4 friends entered Blackwater Cave, a little-known branch of the Mammoth Cave system in Kentucky. The cave was famous among local cave explorers for both its beauty and its dangerous narrow passages. Marcus, Tyler, Sarah, and Jake had set aside a weekend to explore the cave. Marcus was the most experienced member of the group. With over 10 years of caving experience, he had successfully completed many challenging climbs. Tyler, Sarah, and Jake had been inspired by him and had started their caving adventures a few years earlier. Tyler and Sarah moved quickly. They were cautious and calm during climbs. Jake, however, was a bit different. With his hyperactive personality, Jake was the fun-loving kid of the group, but he carried this playful attitude into the cave, and often got himself into trouble. They began exploring the cave. The first few hours went smoothly. Marcus was following the map he had prepared in advance. Then they came across an unmarked side passage on the map. The entrance to the passage was narrow but inviting. A slight breeze was coming from inside. If there was a breeze, it meant there was a large space at the other end of the tunnel. Marcus shook his head and told the group that this passage wasn't on the map and that they shouldn't go through it. Sarah agreed, but Jake couldn't take his eyes off the passage. What if there was something inside that no one had seen? Seeing the look on Jake's face, Marcus firmly stated that entering a passage they knew nothing about was dangerous, but Jake didn't seem satisfied. He would just look a few meters inside. He was sure he wouldn't get stuck. He was thin. He could fit through the passage. At least that's what Jake thought. In reality, he had an average build and was not ideal for this passage. Jake was quite excited to see the other side of the tunnel. Even though the others didn't want to, they were curious too. The group members agreed that Jake would turn back if he felt danger and allowed him to enter the tunnel. The first few meters of the passage were relatively easy. Jake crawled forward. He could hear his friends behind him. When Marcus asked from behind about the condition of the tunnel, Jake said there was no problem and crawled forward a few more meters. The passage began to narrow. Then its shape suddenly changed. In front of him was a passage shaped like an inverted V. Two rock walls met at an angle above, narrowing below until they were almost closed. His legs would be squeezed in the narrow lower part, while his torso would remain in the wider upper part. What's more, that wasn't all. The ground he would have to crawl on to get to the other side was covered with sharp pointed rocks. This greatly increased the likelihood of his clothes getting caught in the already narrow tunnel. What would you do in this situation? Would you consider continuing? So, what do you think Jake did? For a moment, he looked at the passage ahead and thought about turning back. However, an uncontrollable urge inside him compelled him to see the other side of the tunnel. Hesitantly, Jake thought, if I get stuck, I'll turn back, and continued crawling. Jake stretched his arms out in front of him and began to enter the V-shaped passageway, head first. The first few centimeters were easy. Then his body entered the narrow space. He was stuck on one side, but on the other side he tried to continue, thinking, "You're almost there, Jake." Then he stopped. He couldn't move another inch. He realized he was stuck and wanted to turn back, but there was a problem. The moment he started to retreat, his clothes began to gather around his head like they were caught in barbed wire. Feeling his clothes pressing against his throat, Jake felt like he was suffocating. His breathing quickened and his panic grew. He tried to turn back again, but this time, as his clothes wrapped around his neck and waist and began to pull his body down, Jake started coughing. Meanwhile, Tyler, waiting at the tunnel entrance, called out to Jake. The only sound he heard was a muffled voice. It didn't take long for them to realize Jake was stuck. After a moment's thought, Marcus decided to enter the tunnel. The scene he saw was not pleasant. Jake was seriously stuck, and his clothes were preventing him from getting out. The solution was simple: remove Jake's clothes. Marcus was angry at Jake for getting himself into this situation, but there seemed to be no other solution. Even if Tyler and Sarah reached Jake, they couldn't get to him. Marcus turned back, removed all equipment that could get caught on the protruding rocks, took a sharp knife just in case, and began crawling toward where Jake was. Meanwhile, Jake was struggling to breathe, trapped in a very narrow space. His body was sweating, and his sweat-soaked clothes were starting to lower his body temperature. Marcus reached Jake and began cursing as he started to strip him. He took off his shoes and reached for his belt. However, the buckle was stuck and wouldn't come off. After struggling for a while, Marcus decided to cut the belt. He slowly brought the knife towards Jake's waist. It was quite difficult to cut because the belt was stuck against the walls, but after struggling a bit, he managed to cut the belt. He had managed to remove the stuck clothing. Now the situation was even more critical. He had to reach Jake's waist and remove the clothing that was strangling his throat. Jake's clothes were stuck to his body. The jacket's zipper was right where his chest was stuck. Marcus's fingers had to squeeze into the millimeter-wide gap between Jake's body and the rock. Jake groaned in pain and told Marcus to stop. He couldn't breathe. Marcus realized that while trying to reach Jake, he might have pushed him further in. He had to find another way. Marcus told Jake he was going to cut his clothes. Jake couldn't respond anymore. He just gave a raspy breath of approval. Marcus started working with the knife. He started at the back of the jacket. The knife was small and his range of motion was extremely limited. He had to bend his wrist into impossible positions just to hold the knife at the right angle. The knife slipped a few times and cut his own finger. Blood began to flow, but he didn't care. The back of the jacket was torn inch by inch. Finally, Marcus separated the fabric from the rocks. Jake breathed lightly. For the first time in minutes, his chest could expand a little. Marcus got to work. He was also in a confined space. He couldn't fully extend his arms. As his fingers reached through the rocks to Jake's clothes, the sharp stones of the tunnel cut his knuckles. After a long and difficult effort, Marcus managed to remove Jake's clothes. Now Jake was left in just his underwear. The clothes were no longer rubbing against the rocks. He had a chance to move. Marcus grabbed Jake's ankles and began to pull him slowly. The first few centimeters were the hardest. As Jake's body emerged from the V-shaped passage, the rock surfaces scraped his skin. 1 centimeter, 2 centimeters, 5 centimeters, 10 centimeters, 20 centimeters. Then Jake's body suddenly relaxed. He had passed the narrowest point of the V. Marcus kept pulling. Jake's body slid out of the passage. When Jake emerged into the wider part of the passage, Marcus laid him on his back. His body was covered in scratches and scrapes from head to toe. A dark bruise had formed on his stomach, but he was breathing. He was alive. Half an hour later, Jake had recovered enough to walk. The group began to turn back. By the time they emerged from the cave, night had fallen. Jake stopped at the cave entrance and looked back at that dark hole that had nearly swallowed him, that underground world. That night, Jake learned something. Sometimes the greatest danger isn't the cave itself. Sometimes the greatest danger is one's own blind courage. He hadn't listened to his friends. He had ignored their warnings, and he had nearly paid for it with his life.